Hey, CNFers, ready to rock? I sure as hell am. Riff. Ah, yes. It's the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak to badass writers, filmmakers, and producers about the art and craft of telling true stories. For episode 143, I have Blake J. Harris, author of Console Wars, and most recently, The History of the Future, Oculus, Facebook, and the revolution that swept virtual reality. Oh, that feels good. And I need to feel good, because I got shit canned from my job this week. Basically, I was a salesman for a vineyard. I had never done beverage sales in my life. I was subsequently never trained, and then at the height of us, being the O'Meras, getting used to the paycheck, I got fired. Let go, as my wife says. It wasn't fired or let go because of cause. It was basically an experiment gone horribly wrong, and your weekly CNF and host, unfortunately, paid the price. Creative Nonfiction Podcast is sponsored by Goucher College's Masters of Fine Arts in Nonfiction. The Goucher MFA is a 2-year low-residency program. Online classes let you learn from anywhere, while on-campus residencies allow you to hone your craft with accomplished mentors who have Pulitzer Prizes and best-selling books to their names. The program boasts a nationwide network of students, faculty, and alumni, which has published 140 books and counting. You'll get opportunities to meet literary agents and learn the ins and outs of the publishing journey. Visit goucher.edu/nonfiction to start your journey now. Take your writing to the next level and go from hopeful to published in Goucher's MFA program for nonfiction. So naturally, things are a bit on edge around CNF Pod HQ. I've been ramping up the freelancing, getting queries out, getting queries crafted, but even if I land anything, I won't be paid for months, and the pay after taxes will cover like a Happy Meal. It's tough. It's tough. I mean, it's exciting, and I've actually been kind of in a good mood during my days this week, hustling like hell to get more podcasts, which is happening. There's just the calendar's filling up, which is nice. I can fill the pipeline, trying to get more sponsorship and even more freelance work. But it's tough when you know there's no money coming in, and it's my fault. Ultimately, it's my fault. It sucks. Well, be sure to subscribe to the show where you get your podcasts and share this across your platforms. It'll help your old buddy Brendan out. He could use a little help these days. Keep the conversation going on Twitter at Brendan O'Mara and at CNFPod. Same for Instagram at CNFPod and Facebook. Creative Nonfiction Podcast. There, like I always say, you are the social network. So rage against the algorithm, man, and hand this off to a friend. Hey, you want some options? Here's an option for you. Creative Nonfiction Podcast is also sponsored by Bay Path University's MFA in Creative Nonfiction. Discover your story. Bay Path University, founded in New England, where I grew up. In 1897, is the first and only university to offer a no-residency, fully accredited MFA, focusing exclusively on creative nonfiction. Attend full or part-time from anywhere in the world. In the Bay Path MFA, you'll find small online classes and a dynamic and supportive community. You'll master the techniques of good writing from acclaimed authors and editors, learn about publishing and teaching through professional internships, and complete a master's thesis that will form the foundation for your memoir or collection of personal essays. Special elective courses include contemporary women's stories, travel and food writing, family histories, spiritual writing, and an optional week-long residency in Ireland, the Emerald Isle, with guest writers including Andre Dubus III, Anne Hood, Mia Gallagher, and others. Start dates in late August, January, and May. Find out more at baypath.edu/MFA. So Blake J. Harris is here. That's at Blake J. Harris, NYC, on Twitter. Go follow him. Generous dude, smart dude, tells good stories. Love that when you're interviewing someone. Does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. He wrote a hefty book on the history of virtual reality. It's a fast-paced book, and we dive into his unorthodox path to telling true tales and how he put this latest book together. So I hope you enjoy this conversation between me and Blake. You grew up and what kind of kid were you?
I think I was a boring kid. Let's see. Man, I haven't thought about my childhood in so long. So it wasn't like I wanted to be a writer when I was a kid. I basically spent my childhood assuming that I would probably play center field for the New York Yankees, though I had no talent to back up that opinion. Right. But I did watch a lot of television. Which, I knew all the lines to all the syndicated shows like Saved by the Bell and Family Matters. I think my parents thought was a huge waste of time, which I personally think was probably a huge waste of time. But it did really get me interested in storytelling and doing so in like a popular, entertaining way. Right. So if I was going to dissect my career looking at it that way, I think that did inform my style a lot. I guess I wanted to write the Saved by the Bell of VR books, but also have it be filled with historical information. But then, I guess what actually happened, how I got into writing and fell in love with it was I did read a lot as a kid. I got good grades. I did all my homework and did all that stuff, which I don't know why I did in retrospect. But because I feel like so much of life is following your own passion, doing things you're interested in. But anyway, but I was a good kid, and then but I stopped reading along the way. Watched a lot of Saved by the Bell, and then I was interested in dating this girl during my senior year of high school, and she was a big reader, so I asked her to recommend a book, and I read a book to impress her initially, and then I ended up reading a lot of books and realizing that I had missed out on all these great classics. I became obsessed with reading and then wanted to write my own book, and then that led me to wanting to write the great American novel, and I took a few shots at that in college, and it was exactly what you would expect from a semi-arrogant 21-year-old kid who went abroad to write a book. But at least I finished these things. That was really good. And then by the time I graduated college, I was 22. I knew that I loved writing more than anything else. That's what I wanted to do for a living, but I had no idea how to go about making money doing that. I ended up taking a job back in New York where I grew up. I grew up in Westchester in the town of Chappaqua, where the Clintons now live. But I moved to the city, and for the next 8 years, I had a day job trading commodities, buying and selling coffee and sugar and soybeans and other soft commodities. And that was not what I wanted to be doing with my time, but I did work with great Brazilians there who I really loved working with. And one of the upshots to that job was that the market closed at 2:15, so I could leave the office and then spend the rest of the day writing. And at that point, it was mostly screenwriting. I still had no idea how to make a living as a writer, but there seemed to be some semblance of a track when it came to screenwriting, or at least there was you write a script and then you submit it, and sometimes things happen, sometimes doesn't. It seemed a little more tenable than fiction, than prose, and then I guess I for a while I considered film school or getting an MFA. I got rejected from a lot of programs. And then I got into some and decided, I'm going to make my own movies and write my own stuff. Because I guess for me, though, while the talent was always questionable, I was always self-motivated. And at least I knew that, if I set out to write a book, I could do it. It might not be a great book, but I felt like I could probably try to teach myself, or that I was better off as an independent learner. And then one of the big turning points for me was a really disappointing one, was that I had spent all these years doing screenwriting, never found any success at all, but at least I had been successful enough to get good representation, to get a good manager. And so my screenwriting partner and I, my buddy Jonah Tulis, who I still work with, and his name will probably come up later on, but we wrote this script that was called The Sordid Tales of an Evil Tyrannical Ex-Dictator. And it was about a Ricky Gervais-like dictator of a wealthy European country who gets overthrown and moves to to New Jersey to work in the DMV as some sort of a witness relocation program. And as you could probably suspect, this was very much inspired by Coming to America and Trading Places and those kinds of movies from the 80s. And I mentioned this because, this was the script that was going to break our careers, that was going to make us millions of dollars or set up stuff on the path for that. And then about a week after we finished it, Sacha Baron Cohen announced that he was going to be doing a movie about a dictator. And then our project instantly became worthless. And that was really, really depressing, but also, educational. At the time, I didn't really care that much about that component, but it was good because, like, I understood why him having not written a script yet, but saying he was going to do this, why that was way more valuable than what Jonah and I had done, whether it was good or not. That's kind of a fair system. He had earned that credibility. It was unfortunate that people weren't going to read our script now. But then the big takeaway and the reason why I go into like telling the story was that by that point I must have been 27 or 28. I think that always in the back of my mind I had this sort of like sitcom-y idea of like, if I don't make it by the time I'm 30, I'm going to quit, or 35 or 40 or whatever it is. And I sort of realized after that experience, after I spitefully said like, oh, I'm never going to write again, that was just silly, that I loved writing so much that I was never going to stop writing. So any ideas of like, me trying to spite myself to say like, oh, if this doesn't happen, I'm not going to do it. That was silly. So I knew I was going to write. I assumed I was probably never going to make money doing it. And for that reason, I sort of came to terms with that and decided that, whatever I write, it should be something that I'm absolutely 1,000% passionate about. So that way, if a Sacha Baron Cohen situation happens again, so be it. I don't regret my time. And then I think as often seems to happen when I interview successful people in film and other creative professions, the one time I set out to do a project without any expectation of making money off of it, that was driven purely by passion, was the one that really clicked for me. And then that was how I ended up, that was me writing Console Wars, my first book, which, we could talk more about if you want.
Yeah, for sure. And as you were getting your repetitions, from 215 on, or even before then in college and high school, maybe, who was there anybody in particular, maybe a mentor or maybe even your parents, that encouraged you down that path and gave you the permission to keep going and to keep exercising this muscle?
That's a really great question. I think that once I fell in love with writing, I did always hope to find that movie-like, or again, sitcom-like, mentor figure that would challenge me and see the hidden gem talent in me. I never did have an experience like that. I actually, flashing forward to now, I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily the nicest person or anything like that, but I am always very nice and always make time for young writers out there who are looking to write books about video games, because I wish that I had someone to just talk to, or to help me figure out what, how do you make a pitch, or what, what's a proposal look like. So all those things. So I didn't have anyone like that, but what I did have, and what is, pretty obvious in retrospect, I could not have done without and could not have been succeeded without, was incredibly supportive parents. I'll caveat that and say that these were, my mom and dad, who are two of my favorite people in my life. They are also, protective Jewish parents who said I should be a lawyer and told me, they always very much encouraged my writing. And one of the best ways they did that was by actually reading it and being one of the few people in the world who cared what I was writing. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they did impress upon me the importance of getting a stable job. And, they weren't, I guess I just wanted to make the distinction. They weren't the sort of parents who were like, go for it, quit your job, write all day, do that.
Right.
And I think that it was probably good to have that balance because, I guess in the end I was able to make it work by having a day job and also doing that on the side. And it also, made me feel good that when I was finally able to quit my job and to go write full time, but they were incredibly supportive. And I think that my parents are still bummed that I haven't dedicated either of my two books to them, because my wife deserves so much credit. But yeah, I definitely could not have done it without them. And then also just, they were always there to talk. So like when the Sacha Baron Cohen thing happened, I could have just let that lead to bitterness internally. But my parents and my wife too were always there to talk it out with me, to let me vent and yell and complain and whine and be a baby about it. And then that helped me get back on my feet and realize I love this thing. I just got to find a different story or a better story.
And as you were, of course, like going through these repetitions and and finding your voice and practicing, what would you say you were that you struggled with early on? You know, as Ira Glass says about the gap, the creative gap between like what you're capable of doing and what you want to do. There's a big gap, but as you practice more and more, of course, that gap narrows. So early on, what would you say, you were struggling with and worked your way through on your path to, let's say, relative mastery, because no one really masters it?
So for me, around the time when I was in college, when I was becoming more and more sure that I wanted to be a writer and that I really wanted to develop this talent and felt like I could if I put in enough time. That was around, this was like 2004, 2005. This is around the time when Jonathan Safran Foer was at the height of his game, and Dave Eggers. So those were like the two big authors, in my opinion. Like I would read anything that McSweeney's did because of Dave Eggers. And so I think that, and I mentioned them not just because they're both incredible writers, who I recommend everyone read all their stuff, but as often seems to be the case, when there is success, and I see this all the time in sports or movies, it's like you almost take away the wrong lessons. And so I think that what people talk about most with Dave Eggers or Jonathan Safran Foer is their creative decisions. They're almost like their creative gimmicks that they use. And then I definitely went through a period of trying to copy them. And then that's just silly because I'm actually just literally copying their gimmick, or then also trying to come up with my own. And all of this gets to what I think in retrospect was the biggest gap between what I was able to do or what I thought writing was and what I now think writing is. And I was telling this to a friend the other day that, when I was a young writer, and I think this is true of a lot of young writers, you think that being a good writer means writing really awesome sentences. Sometimes that means using great words, big words, or sometimes it just means, really packing a punch in those sentences and really painting a picture. And Eggers and particularly Jonathan Safran Foer are excellent at that, but that's so not why their books are good. Their books are good because they're great storytellers, and those and I was mentioning this in the context of the Da Vinci Code, which I think I don't think Dan Brown writes awesome, fancy, sexy sentences, but I think he's an incredible storyteller when it comes to writing an engaging story. And so that was actually probably that book, The Da Vinci Code, surprisingly enough, was probably a huge part of what influenced me for the rest of my career. I remember I started a book club my sophomore year of college, and the first book that I selected for the book club was The Da Vinci Code, which everyone kind of thought was a weird lowbrow choice. But to me, I was just like amazed that he could write this book that was so engaging and packed so much research into it. And there was, I had a lot of issues with the book, but I just thought to write basically popular fiction and have it be so research based was very impressive. And I think, again, looking through the prism of my own career, like that's kind of how I go about writing things, trying to pack as much research into, a sweet, tasty, easy to digest story.
Yeah. And speaking to, maybe those three authors, before when we said, ask if you had like a mentor, and you didn't really have one per se, but would you say that certain books and maybe specifically those writers are essentially, you would consider them mentors?
Absolutely. I think that I've always been like an introvert. I love interviewing people, but I guess I like to be social on my own terms. And so for me, it probably works better to sort of not to have the independence, to have a mentor, a passive mentor like Jonathan Safran Foer, Dave Eggers, who don't even know that I exist, and to study their works and to aspire to be like them. But I think going ahead in my own career a bit, I hadn't really thought that much about your question or the Ira Glass quote, I had never heard that before, but sort of that gap. And I think that maybe a good place to see that is that as I got older, I started reading a lot more nonfiction, and sort of the influence or the passive mentorship of Jonathan Safran Foer and Dave Eggers was replaced by a similar role by Michael Lewis and Ben Mesrick. And I think that the difference that I now see having this conversation with you is that when I tried, when I was so inspired by Eggers and Safran Foer, I tried to write like them, because they did such a good job and I wanted to do such a good job too and be like them. But then as I was older and when I ended up writing Console Wars and this most recent book, The History of the Future, Michael Lewis and Ben Mesrick definitely influenced me, but it was more like I read their work and I loved it, but I noticed where I would do things differently or where I would have loved for them to, talk more about things. Like I remember this sort of clicked for me when I was reading Ben Mesrick's wonderful book, The Accidental Billionaires, which was optioned and became The Social Network. And I really do. That is one of my all-time favorite books. But I remember thinking like, oh man, I wish that he had spent like 2 pages talking about, around the time that Facebook was being invented by Mark Zuckerberg and Eduardo Saveron and the Winklevoss twins. Like, I wish he had also talked about MySpace and Friendster and, what else was going on in the social media industry so that I understand like why this was happening now or why this was important or how Facebook was different. And so that's something that, I always try to bring to my work is to give a little more context. And so I think that takes like a lot of like confidence to even just say like these, this book that was so successful and that I love that I think that there's ways to improve it, or maybe not even ways to improve it, but things that I would do differently. And, I think that is a good sign of finding your voice when you're reading even your favorite works and seeing how you would do things.
Yeah, I think that underscores a great point of why there are so many great biographies on, say, Abraham Lincoln. It's you read a bunch and you realize that there might be an unexplored corner, or the
Right.
story could be just because it's been told in this way it hasn't been told your way with your taste. So it's a matter,
Right.
and that's the great power of artistic agency with this kind of work, right?
Absolutely. And I think to extend beyond what you're saying. So I had written basically exclusively fiction, whether it was screenwriting, comedies, or my novels. And Console Wars was the first time that I wrote a nonfiction book. Actually, it was the first time I wrote nonfiction at all. I hadn't written, I hadn't worked as a journalist, reporter. I was trading commodities, and I remember thinking midway through writing that it would be hard, that there was just such a level of realism. I mean, kind of duh, but there was like a level of realism to writing about real people that I hadn't achieved with fiction, that I think the best fiction writers do. They create a whole world, they create a whole universe. I always felt like I was maybe like play acting, like I was writing a story. And so that has, that sort of forced me to raise my game a bit. And to really, and the reason I thought of that, getting back to what you were saying, was just like about perspective and having it be my take. And as I've said before, and I kind of say at the front of this new book, I'm such a proponent of oral histories and documentary filmmaking, and but 50 different people can make a documentary on the same thing and they'd all be different, and it's largely because of like which point of views are you going to tell the story through. And so for me, actually talking to people and actually seeing how so many different people who went through the same thing experience it differently, that really helped me cultivate my style and my attempt to try to capture a lot of those different perspectives and also figure out which ones I want to elevate. But yeah, like your point, there's that's why there's a lot of Lincoln books out there, and there will continue to be a lot more.
And given that you had little to no nonfiction experience, how were you able to get access and trust for Console Wars and get that off the ground? Like, given that you didn't have that foundation of, a lot of magazine writing or
Sure.
stuff of that nature, how did you get that going?
That's a great question, because I think that I ultimately I didn't know what I was getting into, and I think that was a good thing. Had I known how hard that was going to be, that that aspect of it, gaining trust and just even being put in touch or finding the right people, I maybe would have given myself an excuse to not do it. But because I was just like, and then the other thing too was my own curiosity. And also I'll backtrack and just give you a little brief introduction of how that book happened. So I was kind of down on my luck after the screenwriting thing. And then my brother bought me a Sega Genesis for my birthday. Maybe I think it was like my 28th birthday.
Nice.
And then it was, I was playing NHL 94, which is what him and I used to play when we were kids.
Yeah.
It's the best game ever.
That's so good. That was the inaugural or the very first time like one-timers were put into hockey games, I think.
Yeah. Yes. I'll send you after the show, my favorite thing that I've written besides my 2 books and besides my oral history of the TV show The League, which I love, is like a 8,000 word essay on NHL 94.
Oh, yes.
and learning how did one-timers come about. But it was kind of that same curiosity of like, how did one-timers get put into that game? And that was what happened. I was playing the Genesis and thinking to myself, like I don't know that much about Sega. I also was realizing that my favorite books as an adult or as someone who was 28 at the time were behind-the-scenes business stories by Michael Lewis, Ben Mesrick, books like The Smartest Guys in the Room or Disney were by James Stewart. And so before I ever set out to write Console Wars, I honestly just wanted to read a book like Console Wars. And I remember going to Barnes & Noble on 86th Street here in Manhattan. It's a gigantic store. I initially looked for a book like this I was looking in the film history section and then the music history section, assuming that the video game history section couldn't be far away. There was no such section. I asked the woman at the information desk where the video game history section was, and she actually laughed at me. And then I asked for, I said, can I just get one of the books about Sega and Nintendo or, the business of video games, or the history of video games? And they didn't have a single book in the entire store. And that was very weird to me because I didn't, I was not a gamer. I did not have that much experience with the gaming industry, but I knew enough to know that it was very successful. And the only books that they actually had in the store related to gaming were walkthrough guides. So like basically how to play games. There was nothing about the industry. Mm-hmm. And then I went, I left there. And I should also mention that it wasn't even one of those situations where she said oh, well, here's 5 books. We can order them for you, which was always weird because I can order them myself. But they didn't, nothing even came up on her computer. So I thought that was odd. It wasn't like I left Barnes & Noble that day and thought like, aha, here's like a market demand that I'm going to fill. But I, it inspired me to see what was out there about the history of Sega and Nintendo online, which was not that much. And then also find the few books about video games that had been written about the business side. And there's a great book by David Sheff called Game Over, which was like about the history of Nintendo. And his book is like largely, it is the history of Nintendo. So it goes back to the late 1800s, but mostly it's about Nintendo resurrecting the video game market in the 1980s with the NES system. And then towards the end of the book, Sega releases their Genesis system as a competitor to Nintendo. And the book sort of ends with this whole idea of like, there's something called the World Wide Web that's coming and, CD-ROMs might change everything. And I felt like, wow, like the book's about to get exciting. There's finally like a challenger. So in a lot of ways, I kind of viewed my book as a sequel to that. And then so getting back to your question, like once I decided, okay, there is no sequel to this, or there is no book about Sega Nintendo, I want to write it. How do I get the access? And the answer early on was through a website that I had made a lot of fun of in the past, which was LinkedIn. I literally just typed Sega and Nintendo, and thousands of names came up. I made a list of like who was there during the times that would have been relevant to the story I was interested in telling. And then it was just a numbers game. I think like 10% of people actually replied to me, and that was okay because that was, even though 90% of the people said no. I now had 10%, I now had 20 people or however many people to talk to that I hadn't before. And then through those conversations, my initial goal was to just identify whether there was a story here.
Right.
Like as a kid, you sort of imagine working at Sega or Nintendo. It's like working at Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. But I did also prepare for the possibility that I would talk to people and that they would say, no, it was a good job, but it was just like punching the time card. I made my money in and out every day, or maybe that there was no passion to it. And I found out that was the opposite, that almost everybody that I spoke with who worked at Sega and Nintendo during that time period of 1985 to 1996 or so, that it was often, they described it as the greatest time of their life, and almost like they were waiting for me to talk to them, or they were waiting for someone to tell their stories to, which made my job easier at first. Again, I was kind of fortunate that I wasn't, trying to rip open oysters that wanted to stay shut. But that people were so happy to share with me at first helped, and then they also were enthusiastic enough to often put me in touch with other people and other people. And I definitely took it for granted at the time, because now with this new book and some of the access issues and the difficulties there, it was that was much more of like a journalistic experience of trying to extract information and dealing with deceptive people. But Console Wars was really great in that regard. It did take me 3 years to speak to everyone that I wanted to, and then to write the book, or then I guess to sell the book proposal. And then I quit my commodities job. My final day was on my 30th birthday, and then because it was my last time being in New York City for a while, and because I had always wanted to be a professional writer before I proposed to my girlfriend of, at that point, I think like 8 years, I went to go pick up the ring that day and I was going to propose to her a few weeks later, but then I got home and there was a surprise party for my 30th birthday, and my uncle said, "How does it feel to be the center of attention?" And I said, "It's okay, but I don't really like being the center of attention." And he said, "Well, sorry, it's your birthday." And then I said, "Well, maybe not." And then I proposed to my now wife, and so she became the center of attention. And then, I like the way that you've had me tell this story, because it is, my own personal narrative. It is this crazy, wonderful story that I'll love telling a million times, because it's how I got to do what I love for a living. But it did feel like almost like wow, all that time and all that work, and now I finally done it. But really, a couple of weeks after that, it was like, all right, now I have to write the book. Like, I haven't actually done anything yet, but like now you have to do the thing. And so that was daunting, but amazing.
Did you run into feelings of the dreaded imposter syndrome, given that you didn't have like that classic journalist background as you were plunging into this narrative history of this console war?
Yeah, absolutely. I still feel imposter syndrome. I was actually, right before we spoke, I was doing a different interview, and they asked about Palmer Lucky's imposter syndrome, and I said that he still felt it. I think almost all the successful people I know, the celebrities that I've had the opportunity to either befriend or to write about, they all feel it, and it's just surreal to get to do what you want for a living and that other people care. And the point I made to the interviewer was that as I was on the call with them, and as I am on this call with you right now, I'm looking at the cover of my book, The History of the Future, and there is a really small but strong part of me that thinks like, wow, that book looks cool. I'd like to read that book. And then I'm thinking, no, like I wrote that book. I know what's in there. It just feels crazy that to go from writing for an audience of my parents and my girlfriend to an audience of hundreds of thousands. And so I would say, I had, over the years, I've grown less neurotic, but I was pretty neurotic, and I probably could have psyched myself out of writing Console Wars, or really put myself into a weird place where like, oh, do I deserve this? There was also going to be a movie based on it by Seth Rogen, and all that stuff. And I'm sure to some degree I got a little nervous about like, am I going to be able to do this thing that now everyone's counting on? And I think that what really made that a small concern of mine and helped me get past that pretty quickly is the thing that I love about nonfiction. It's that I'm spending so much time interviewing real people, and I always kind of imagine it like I'm like a bank, and they're depositing their stories into me, and that creates a responsibility to it. Like these people are not just gonna give you their stories and give you their time and then say like, all right, I'll never talk to you again. Like they're excited about it. They want to know like, how far along are you, or have you spoken to this person? And that creates like a sense of like obligation in a very good way. Like I want to do right by these people. I want to tell a story that properly honors all this awesome stuff that they did. And I think about that a lot, because like I told you, early in my career, I thought about fiction. I wrote fiction, and people ask me if I have an interest in writing fiction, and I have an interest in writing anything. But I do feel like I probably would never finish my fiction book because I would just keep going and going or thinking about other things and tangent. But like, whereas when I'm writing these books about real people and dealing with them every day or every week or whatever, I need to actually execute. I need to produce tangible results, and I think that that's a really good thing.
What would you say you learned from the generation of, by generation I mean the generative process of bringing console wars into being, and what did you take away from that you were able to successfully apply to your next book?
The biggest lesson that I learned is most simply condensed into the idea of who I write for when I write my books, or when I write anything, actually. And that is that I genuinely imagine my grandmother reading my work and what she'll think, because whether I'm writing a high-tech story about virtual reality and Oculus, or about video game battles with Sega Nintendo, or about the making of a terrible movie like Kazam for How Did This Get Made, like I'm trying to think, maybe my grandma won't read these things. I mean, she will because she's an awesome grandma. But like, maybe she wouldn't pick up a book like this. But if she did pick up a book like this, how could I keep her attention? How could I get her to be interested in the story of the making of Kazam, or the making of a virtual reality headset? And it is by, to me, the solution is almost always by writing a character-driven story and trying to find the universal ideas. And so Console Wars, obviously, corporate battle story. There's a Moneyball aspect to it, but the book begins very intentionally with a guy on a beach who's in between jobs in his career, thinks that his best years might be behind him. He thinks they probably are, and then he's approached with a job opportunity that seems mysterious but interesting. And I think people can relate to that. There's something enticing about that. So for me, the biggest lesson was how, like I said earlier, it's like storytelling. Like how can I make these stories interesting? Another I guess like big influence or something that I learned a lot from was was Game of Thrones, the books. Those books are they're all written in the third person, but as people who've read the books know, like every chapter is from someone's perspective. And then I guess prior to that, I always kind of assumed perspective was like a first person thing, like it would have to be Jon Snow's perspective, like I'm Jon Snow. But no, actually, you can have third person perspectives, and that's really just more about like someone's take on a story. And then you start to see, oh wow, the like Sansa has a different perspective than Jon, even though it's the same scene. And then the other thing I really took away that I was getting at here with Game of Thrones was like that book, and even the first season of the show is like, it's really just like political drama and like almost like a business battle, but it's told through interesting characters, and stylistically the book is basically just a bunch of scenes with dialogue, and then in between the scenes you'll have like 5 pages of context about the history of these families or the history of Winterfell or something like that. And so seeing that I could do something similar, like that kind of gets to like the stuff I was talking about with Ben Mesrick earlier. Like I love his work, but I would prefer if sometimes in between these scenes he gave us more context, because that not only is that educational and interesting, but I think that as with Game of Thrones, like it gives more weight to the story that you're seeing, and now you actually understand, oh, that's why this is a big deal that this guy says this. I guess seeing what worked was a big lesson for me. Seeing that this thing the style that I thought should exist more in nonfiction actually seemed to work, or at least the people reading it and my editors and my agents and all that were giving me really good feedback. That I felt like I hadn't really seen too many nonfiction books like the one that I felt that I was writing, and to see that people were digging that was pretty awesome and educational for me.
Yeah, in the course of any book of narrative nonfiction, what's always a challenge, I think, for any reporter or researcher is generating white space on the page by dialogue. Dialogue, just your screenwriting background, it really comes up in this, given that it's so dialogue driven, and that's very quick reading. That white space on the page, it's a big
Right.
book, so seeing those pages filled with a lot of snappy dialogue between these integral characters really helps with the pacing and the reader experience. So, given how challenging it can be to create dialogue that is as verifiably true as possible, how did you go about that, and as a strategy, and then how did you really nail down the verbiage as best you could through the course of your research?
So I'm really glad that you asked about the dialogue, because I think that two things there. One is in 2014. I would say roughly that 75 to 80% of people really liked or loved the book, and about 20 to 25% of people thought it was the worst nonfiction book ever written. And the ones who criticized it and hated it, they talked about the dialogue. There is a lot of dialogue in that book. It's conversations that happened 25 or so years ago. It's also recreated dialogue. It's recreated scenes. Sometimes I put together, if there were several meetings that happened over a course of months, I condensed it into one meeting. So, a journalist would never do that. And so I had mentioned that as in the author's note of that book. So it wasn't like I was, trying to get away with something there, but it was a stylistic choice, and one that I'm proud that I made. I think that was the right way to tell the story. I think that properly honored these people and captured the spirit of what happened. And I guess the one takeaway from that was, well, first, there was my first time I ever got criticism, since the first time anyone read my stuff. And so it really made me think, like, did I do the right thing here? And when people are, saying negative things about you, sometimes you think you don't, just for that reason. But then after talking to the people that the book was about and how much they said it captured it and how authentic it was, I realized, okay, they were the audience that I cared about most. They were the ones who actually know if I did my job well or not. So I don't regret it at all. I do wish that I had shared in the author's note that I worked in close collaboration with these people, so that people didn't think that I was just like, sitting on a beach somewhere and making up snappy dialogue.
Yeah.
But fortunately, I think I was also given the benefit of the doubt, because it was a 550-page book that was so research-driven. So people didn't assume that I was doing that to begin with, except for maybe some 15% of people. But like, I think that was important, and because there was criticism around that, and it really did make me think a lot about why I had made certain choices, and it made me feel like I had made the right choices to tell that story. But then with this book, and then especially with how this most recent book, largely by the end of it, or one of the themes towards the end of it, is failures in the media and failures of journalism, I felt like I needed to do a better job there, and have much more hard and fast rules with this book to make sure that this book, that I felt as much like a journalist in this book as I felt like a storyteller. And so two rules that I made for myself with this book were, one, whereas Console Wars would, sometimes recreate scenes of, like, several meetings over several months, could be condensed into one meeting. In this book, I did not write anything that I couldn't provide an exact date for. So I wanted to make sure that everything in there was a very specific date that I had the records for and could tell you this is exactly what happened on this day. And then the dialogue, I wanted to make sure that it really accurately represented these people, and so I wanted it, I wanted it to be like a documentary, in the sense that every line of dialogue I wrote was a line of dialogue that I was told by somebody. So sometimes it would be secondhand, of people remembering what someone else told them, as in like a documentary, you would say, and then this guy said this. But most of the time it was firsthand, and that way I was able to capture the verbal tics of people. And I recorded every conversation I had for this book, which ended up becoming a very wise decision with the whole Facebook access aspect. But, like, I actually, in a very amateur way, because I didn't know what I was getting into with Console Wars, like I said earlier, and I think that was mostly a good thing. But, like, I took notes on all my conversations. I didn't record any of my conversations. It was, I typed very fast, so I think I captured most of it. But this time, if you would ask me to describe in an image what my experience of writing the history of the future was like. The image that comes to mind for me is like from the movie is Gene Hackman in The Conversation, of him just like listening to conversations. Like I feel like so much of my time was spent just transcribing these conversations and rewinding and getting a sense of how these people spoke and capturing all the likes and ums. And that's why with this book, the opening sentences from Mark Zuckerberg announcing the appearing at Oculus to tell the team that he's acquiring it for $3 billion. There's a lot of likes and ums and commas in there because I really wanted this to completely capture exactly how people described it to me, or in that case, that was a video of him that I had. And part of that too was because I had the luxury, because this was a more recent story that people remembered more, and then part of it too was because of the stuff at the end of basically reporting on Mark Zuckerberg illegally asking an employee or forcing an employee to lie about his politics, and because Facebook's a publicly traded company, because I think there's a lot of concerns to be had about Facebook. I wanted to make sure that this book was really bulletproof when it came to the creative aspects of nonfiction, which I think were important to telling the story in an exciting way, in a way that honored those who lived it. But I also didn't want anyone to ever think that like, oh, this is just a story. This, we can't trust the information, because you should definitely trust the information here.
Yeah, and how has your relationship to Facebook changed over the course of this book?
Significantly, night and day. So after Console Wars came out in May of 2014. Within the next couple of months, by that summer, I knew that I was interested in writing a book about Oculus and about virtual reality. But as anyone could see from the two books I write, or anything I write, like getting access is so key for me. It would have been very hard to write an Oculus story in this kind of style without having close relationships with Palmer or Brendan or Narav or the people in the book. So I was introduced to Palmer Luckey in July. I was introduced to Palmer in July of 2014, and Palmer, who was 19 years old when he founded Oculus, and at that point, I guess he was 21 years old. He said something that I thought was very mature. I told him basically, I'm interested in writing a book about you and Oculus, and he said that I was not the first journalist to reach out with such a request, but in his opinion, Oculus hadn't accomplished anything yet. They had just sold to Facebook for $3 billion, and they had done a successful job of reigniting interest in virtual reality. But he said that they now needed to go from selling a gimmicky gaming toy to creating a mainstream device, and they had their work cut out for them. But at the same time, he really loved Console Wars, as did other people at the company, and so he was at least open to having the conversation. And we had that conversation over the course of the next 20 months, or basically in February of 2016, 1 month before they launched their first consumer product, the Oculus Rift, the CV1 headset. I was given access. I went out to Facebook in July. I went out to Facebook in February 19th and 20th, around that time of 2016. I found out that not only would I be given like the interviews with the people that I wanted, but that Facebook was basically giving me exclusive access, at least amongst authors, that I was going to be the only author these people were speaking with. And then I ended up speaking to a lot of them every day for the next 2 or 3 years. And so at first, Facebook was incredibly supportive. They set up that trip for me. They set up interviews with Brendan Reeve, the CEO, with Nate Mitchell, co-founder, with Palmer Luckey, the founder I mentioned, and then I made a list of like, here's other people that I'm interested in speaking with, and they, the extent of their help was basically the arrangement was that they would introduce me to anyone that I was interested in speaking with, and basically say like, we're supportive of this project. And then it was up to the person that they introduced me to whether they wanted to speak with me or not. And then after that, it was at our discretion to speak as often as possible, and to have our own relationship. So that was pretty respectable. That was good that Facebook wasn't on every call and really trying to push the thing in a certain direction.
Right.
And that was great on my end. Like I didn't owe them like I say it was an arrangement, but the arrangement was really that they arranged it for me. that out of courtesy, I always actually share my work with the people that I write about, or at least I share the parts that I've written based on information that they provided me and give them a chance to review. But I was very clear with them, as I am with anyone, that doesn't give them the right, I'm not going to necessarily take their feedback or change things if they ask me to.
Yeah.
I just usually find that is a great way to fact check. It's also a great way to bring up other memories. And then, as we'll get to here, I did that for the first half of the book. And that was all fine because there was nothing illegal or scandalous in the first half of the book. And then, but I never ended up doing it for the second half of the book because my relationship with them fell apart. And I guess to describe that, I should probably describe a little bit about what happened with Palmer and how he ended up being fired in the middle of my writing this book. Is that a good thing for me to do?
Yeah, please do. Right. This is where the book definitely takes a turn, an unexpected turn that you don't see coming.
Yeah, I certainly did not see it coming. To me, what I thought was awesome about this book. So obviously, I love virtual reality. I'm also a little bit scared of it, like other new technologies. But I really, I loved this story. To me, it was just an American dream story. A kid invents something in 2012, and what is it like in this day and age when you invent something? How do you make a business out of it? How do you make money? How do you get it to other people? And all those kinds of interesting questions. And can Palmer Luckey, a kid who starts the book living in a trailer, can he pull himself up from rags to riches by his bootstraps or whatever? And so it was very much just the ultimate entrepreneurial journey, and all book about virtual reality. And then, like you said, the book takes a total twist. Starting in September of 2016, the book really becomes about something else. So what happened was on September 22nd, 2016, this was I guess 6 weeks before the presidential election in 2016, an article came out by the Daily Beast with the headline, Facebook billionaire secretly funding Trump's meme machine. And the insinuation was that every dirty meme that you had seen online over the past election season, every terrible gif of a concentration camp or, misogynistic comment or transphobic, Islamophobic comment, that basically this guy Palmer Luckey, the main character of the book, that he was somehow running a troll operation to disseminate this terrible, hateful stuff. And what, almost all of that turned out not to be true. But what was true was that Palmer was a Trump supporter. And that was something that I had found out a couple months before. He had told me. I very much was not, and very much still am not, a Trump supporter. I was really depressed when he won the presidency. I'm often really disappointed by him. So, this was Palmer and I have different political views, but I guess the difference between me and the difference between Facebook is that I'm okay with that. I kind of find that interesting, especially with such a thoughtful, good-natured person like him, who doesn't just say because. If Trump does something I don't like or says something I don't understand, I'll talk to him about it, and he'll actually answer me, and I'll learn something from it, or he'll learn something from it. But at Facebook, which is very, very progressive and liberal oriented, and also just a very mission oriented company, what ended up happening was, in the immediate aftermath of this PR fallout of this story that accused Palmer of running a troll factory, that led to dozens and dozens of articles and dozens and dozens and dozens of people on social media calling him the worst person ever. In fact, Wired had an article called "Palmer Luckey is the worst," so they literally called him the worst person ever, or worst person in Silicon Valley. One thing I'll say is I just remember reading all these articles, and obviously I had more information about the situation than the average person, but I do remember trying to think how I would read this if I was just the average person, and or someone who had no inside information. And my first thought was okay, if Palmer is somehow supporting this group that is making terrible memes, let me see the memes. Let me see how bad they are. Let me see, if Palmer was supporting something that was putting out concentration camp memes, then yeah, that's really messed up. And I would have a lot of questions for him. But no website presented any of the memes except for one billboard that this organization had put up in Pittsburgh, which was a very typical political advertisement. It was a picture, a caricature of Hillary Clinton that said "too big to jail." There was nothing, hateful about it. It was, I guess, didn't like Hillary, but it was nothing unsavory, and so that was always kind of a red flag to me. But anyway, Palmer wrote a statement explaining what was true and what was not true about the article that was out there, and explaining that that most of it was untrue, but that what was true was that he was a Trump supporter, and here's why he was a Trump supporter. And that statement did not end up going out that evening, and still the next day it didn't end up going out because he was, it rose to the higher levels at Facebook, and he was not allowed to put a statement out there saying he was a Trump supporter, and then actually, like the next day, he kept asking, when can I put up my statement, because the backlash just kept getting worse and worse. And the reason it took so long was because Mark Zuckerberg personally got involved and personally drafted a statement of his own that Palmer had to post if he wanted to keep his job. And that statement, in that statement, it says that I plan to vote for Gary Johnson, meaning that Palmer would have to post this and say that he was voting for Gary Johnson, which was obviously not true.
Yeah.
But Palmer ended up doing so because he wanted to keep his job. For the next 6 months, he was kept out of the office and not allowed to communicate with his colleagues and not explain what had happened, not explain anything about this organization that he had donated to. And so what ended up happening was that Palmer came across as a liar for saying that he was supporting Gary Johnson when he seemed to be a Trump supporter. And so he was hated by Trump supporters for not supporting Trump publicly. And he was hated by liberals for being a troll and for seeming to support Trump, or at least voting for Gary Johnson, which people would say is complicit in helping Trump win. And then 6 months after that, he was fired. And I remember when he was fired, the original article came out, and it didn't say he was fired. It said, Palmer Luckey was exiting Facebook. It didn't say whether he resigned or he was fired. And then no details came out about what had happened. And then what I found most shocking, and this will take it back to my experience reporting on this, was that, externally, Facebook just said he exited the company. But internally, Facebook, which is this company based on an ethos of openness and transparency and has town halls every Friday that Mark Zuckerberg speaks at, and, always encourages employees that, they literally hang signs on campus that say, always assume positive intent in your colleagues and be your most authentic self, that they didn't provide any information to anybody about what was happening with Palmer. And then eventually they just told the team that he was leaving the company, and they never gave their employees any information, which ended up helping me a lot because those employees turned to me and also ended up leaking some critical documents to me. But then taking this back to Facebook, I ended up, during what turned out to be my last trip out to Menlo Park, to their campus in February of 2018, I made it very clear to the high ups there that I needed to provide some explanation for what happened to Palmer. That Palmer was unwilling to talk to me about it. I assumed that he had signed some sort of legal document that prevented him from doing so because him and I still had a pretty positive relationship, and that I had heard that there might be a political component to it, and so they told me no, that wasn't the case at all. Over the next few days and weeks, I ended up speaking with a lot of high-ranking people at Oculus and Facebook who all told me the same story about how Palmer chose to leave and how politics had nothing to do with it and how he had chosen to write that statement and all this stuff that I later found out was absolutely untrue. And then when I called them out on this, and I guess first of all, the way that I knew it was not true was because I was able to get internal documents that proved otherwise. So it wasn't like this was like a he said, she said, where they have their version and Palmer or some other camp has their version. I ended up deferring to the actual email exchanges and text message exchanges and all that. But then what I came to realize when I was suspecting that I was being fed misinformation was that my writing style, my creative nonfiction writing style, which by design does not attribute the information to specific sources. It comes from, I'll only include things if I'm able to confirm it. And, but it's really kind comes from a lot of different people, and it doesn't say, this quote is from this person. And so I came to realize that they were laundering that misinformation through my writing style, or that was my suspicion. And to confirm this suspicion, I decided that I would, email Facebook my contacts there and say that, hey, I decided to do 6 experimental chapters that are just going to be Q&As. That way, what happened to Palmer isn't coming from my words as Blake Harris, the author, or Blake Harris, the liberal, but through your words, and you guys will describe what happens. And so, like I said earlier, I fortunately recorded every conversation I had. And so I put out I transcribed one of those recorded conversations and shared that with them. And then almost immediately they stopped talking to me, and they told all of their employees to stop talking to me, which is weird because if what they were telling me was true, they shouldn't really have that much of a problem. I mean, maybe they could have not liked the style or had suggestions, but the fact that they wanted me to kill that and the way that they reacted otherwise was pretty indicative of they just didn't want this traced back to them, or that was the tip of the iceberg.
Jeez. Have you sort of geared up for any kind of backlash from them, or how's that been received since the book's been out?
Good question. Well, I think it's important to note, especially for other writers out there, that while that was kind of like a devastating, or it was I guess not shocking, so I can't say it was devastating because I suspected this, but like while that was an ordeal, let's just say that it was an ordeal, I was able to sort of turn some lemons into lemonade out of it, in the sense that I felt betrayed by Facebook, and then I thought, okay, well, I'm not the only one, because I also know that they are lying to their employees. And so I went to a lot of the sources that I had been speaking with and basically shared with them, here's what I am being told by Facebook, and here's what I'm being told by executives at Oculus. And if this doesn't seem correct to you, which they all agreed this was not true, I mean, at the very least, saying that Palmer chose to leave on his own was just ridiculous. And but anyway, and I basically said, asked them to help me, like, if I don't have other concrete information, this is the version I have to run with. And they all cared enough about Palmer, or at least cared enough about getting the truth out there, that they really stepped up and got me the information that I needed to present this in a way where I could report some of these, explosive and illegal things, and make sure that I had the confidence that I was doing so accurately. So that was just a good tip that I picked up along the way, to find other people who are feeling as upset as I was. And then in terms of the backlash from Facebook, a couple of weeks before the book came out, I started, emerging from hibernating these past 4 years and posting some things about the book, and people at Oculus were getting excited about it and sort of sharing it in internal chats. And then that was, shut down, or management came into those chats and made a few statements about me in the book, to try to dampen the enthusiasm, basically saying, I guess first of all I should say that the fact that I know what they were saying is a pretty good sign that people at Oculus trusted me more than management, that they were leaking these things to me that would have probably cost them their job. But they were basically, saying, we worked with Blake early on, but then he broke our trust, and we haven't seen the book yet, but we believe it, manufactures a lot of drama, and so I ended up writing a long email to everyone to a bunch of people at Oculus that ended up circulating, saying that they worked with me for 2 years, so it wasn't like some little thing that happened early on that they broke my trust, or at least here's the facts of why I believe that's the case. The idea that I would manufacture drama is ridiculous and like hurtful, because that's why I spent 3.5 years on this book, because I wanted to get it right, and there's so much drama here. There was no reason for me to need to manufacture it. And then I just thought it was in typical Facebook fashion that I knew that they had a copy of my book. So when they were telling people that they hadn't seen the book yet, they obviously had. So that was, fortunately, after that, and after I sent this email to the people at Oculus to let them know that I knew what they were saying about me, nothing has really happened since then, which is good. I think that maybe from a marketing standpoint, it would be better if it could be potentially better if there was some sort of flame war between Facebook saying, oh, I'm wrong and I lied, and me saying, no, here's the documents. But I don't really want that. I want, my goal is, obviously I do want to sell a lot of books, but my goal is to tell the story. and that's just friction that prevents me from getting the story out there or continuing to follow up with other people. And I don't like controversy if I could avoid it. And I also, again, like the most important thing with this book to me was to make sure that people understood that this was the version of events that actually happened with so much information out there. So I didn't really want that shrouded with any noise and people taking sides. Though I don't know who would take Facebook's side after this. So maybe it was a poor decision on my part, and I should have courted controversy. But in terms of like backlash, I think the most interesting one is I basically operated the past 2 years assuming that when this book came out, it would be liked or loved or accepted by like half of the people out there, and that the other half of the feedback I was getting was that I'm a terrible person for writing this book because they believe the things about Palmer Luckey, that like I was supporting a white supremacist or a misogynist or this terrible person. And I've been so happy to see that. I think it's been 100% really positive, and of people realizing that that Facebook had treated him unfairly, that the media had treated him unfairly, and being incredibly supportive of that. So I haven't faced that backlash. And part of the reason I felt that way was because the only thing that I had published over the past year and a half, because I did really try to hibernate and sort of go undercover and do this, do my thing reporting this book and stay out of the news and not report it. Anyway, the only thing I had put out was a story called "This Is How Fake News Happened," that explained, that was used only publicly available information to show how the story about Palmer was wrong, and that here's how it perpetuated like a game of telephone, getting worse and worse with each outlet. And the reaction to that was like the one I described, like the one I expected. Half the people thanked me for, following the truth or whatever they thought, or maybe they were Palmer supporters and liked that I did something that seemed to support Palmer. And then half the people told me I was a terrible person or unfriended me or whatever. There was a lot of people in the media who unfriended me because it was pretty critical of them. So anyway, I've been so happy that that's not been the case here. Because as you know from reading the book, so much of the end of the book is because of this, because of just bad information, of misunderstanding, of misreporting, and then also I think just a misunderstanding of people about those with different political views. And I hope that in whatever very, very, very small way, my book could help make our country less polarizing and realize that we are in this together, that people who have different opinions are not having those opinions because they want to hurt you, and that almost all those opinions, wouldn't hurt you. It's just a different opinion. And so, it's been an interesting past couple of years. Like you said, the book takes a big twist, and my life did as well.
And has your enthusiasm towards VR and in certain aspects of, say, social media dampened as a result of you flying so close to this sun?
Great question. I mean, with regards to social media, yes, but I think collectively as a country, I think everyone's sort of feeling that, Mm-hmm. I think the election, whether or not you like Donald Trump or not, I think the election and the coverage of it and the way social media played a role really opened people's eyes to a lot of the ways that it could be amplified by bad actors, and how maybe sometimes those bad actors are members of the media, but that's not really fair to call them bad actors, because I often think that people are trying to do the right thing. I just think they're not doing it fairly, or they're missing critical information. But in terms of the virtual reality one, that's a really interesting and important question, given that the book is about VR. And I'll say that, like, when Oculus was acquired by Facebook for $3 billion in 2014, a lot of early Oculus enthusiasts and VR enthusiasts were very disappointed, and they all hated Facebook, and they thought Facebook was going to ruin VR. And I thought that they were being a little dramatic about it, because for me, the most interesting thing to me about VR was the social component, the communication aspect. So I thought that's a win to have Facebook involved, who's focused on that. Then the other thing too was that not only was Facebook paying $3 billion to acquire Oculus, they were also going to be investing billions of dollars over the next few years. So as a VR enthusiast myself, that was a win too, that Facebook was going to help create this ecosystem. But now I think that I was naive in that perspective to some degree, and like that sort of crystallized for me probably much later than it should have. But I was at a book signing a couple of weeks ago, and somebody asked me about Oculus's upcoming headset. They have this headset called the Oculus Quest that Facebook and Oculus are putting out this spring. It's going to cost $400. It's going to be a standalone headset, meaning that it doesn't need to plug into a computer, meaning that for $400 you'll have the whole experience. And it's basically going to be the best technologically it'll be the best VR headset ever, or at least ever at this sort of price point. And they said, I'm very interested in this, but I'm worried about buying it because I don't trust Facebook, and I've deleted Facebook off my phone. Like, what do you recommend? And I did not have a good answer for them. And I still don't have a good answer 2 weeks later, because I don't trust Facebook. A big part of the reason why I wanted to include all this stuff with Palmer and politics into the book, there's the obvious reason that because Palmer was the main character, and also because it's interesting, it's fascinating. It's anytime Mark Zuckerberg is forcing employees to lie is fascinating. But more so, like, conceptually, my thought was that Facebook bought Oculus because they want to own virtual reality. They want to own this platform, or they want to at least be as big of a player as possible. And the way that if Facebook wants to own virtual reality, then I think the way that they act in actual reality and how they treat employees and how they treat their users is incredibly important, because history is going to repeat itself there. So, as we have conversations these days about censorship and free speech, and as Facebook continues to expand beyond 2 billion users, I think that these are all, really important concerns to have. And I'm certainly not the first to bring them to mind. There are great journalists out there doing great work at the New York Times, or Politico the other day reporting that Elizabeth Warren's advertisements suggesting that, maybe technology companies should be broken up, that Facebook ban those advertisements. And so it's, I hope that my book is just part of this mosaic of people thinking more about the role that Facebook and Google and these big tech companies play in our lives. And one other thing I'd like to mention on the subject is, like, I hear people say, oh, Facebook is evil. Like, I definitely don't think they're evil. I think that they are a company with their own vision and motivations. And if you look at it through that lens, a lot of their actions make sense. It makes a lot of sense why they wouldn't want Palmer Luckey there, because he has different political views and a different vision for the future than they do. That's illegal, and I would want big companies to have people with different views, or at least be more tolerant to them. But like there's a line in one of the, I ended up getting, I think I mentioned in the book, over 25,000 internal documents, and one of them was this great sort of manifesto vision statement by Mark Zuckerberg about the future of virtual reality and augmented reality. And he's talking about the business strategy, but he opens up the document by saying, and towards the top of it, that in addition to the benefit that this technology will provide humanity, ... and then he talks about the strategy. And I just thought, like, wow, that's such a supervillain way to think about things. And like I do think Mark actually thinks he is doing what's best for the world. It's more what I've come to realize, or at least my barometer for harmful actions, is that I do think intentions matter, but I think that the fact that Facebook never gives people the option to opt out or do something different is really the problem. And I'll end this rant by mentioning something that seems tangential, but I think kind of cuts it really what I'm talking about here, which is that I met with Andrew Bosworth, who's the head of AR and VR for Facebook, during my, like I said, what turned out to be my last trip to Facebook. And, we were just having small talk before getting into the interview and talking about this problem of fake news. And I said, hey, this is something I think about a lot, the state of journalism and how to improve it. And here's an idea that I had that might be stupid, but like, here's my idea. And I told him that I thought that Facebook should have a little clock that when people share articles on Facebook, it should say how long they spent reading it. That way you would know, oh, this is like an article they probably just read the title of and they're sharing it, or this is an article that they spent 10 minutes reading. There's probably something in depth there. And I think I like this idea. I could totally understand if someone thinks it's a very stupid idea, but I thought that the response that I got was interesting, and it doesn't matter whether they think it's a good idea or not, which was that Andrew Bosworth told me that how much time you spent reading an article is already part of the algorithm, which really translates to, yes, that is important information, and we're using that to decide what to show you, as opposed to giving you the option to decide what the criteria is of stuff that you want to be shown. And I think that is like how a lot of things work with Facebook, in that they think that they know what's best for you. And maybe they do, or maybe they do most of the time. But I think that you should always at least give people the option to decide what's best for them and to curate their own experiences. And then especially when you get into a place where you don't know whether the decisions, you don't know what incentives are guiding that algorithm. Maybe it's that they are trying to guide you towards a certain behavior that we might all agree is good, or maybe they're trying to guide you towards a behavior that's incentivized by them getting advertising dollars. Maybe they want you to be thirstier to buy a Coca-Cola. Like, the fact that you don't know is really the problem, and the fact that it's this black box is really this problem. And so if virtual reality is the next frontier and Facebook really wants to control that frontier, I think these are all questions that we should be asking ourselves and asking them.
Blake, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this so eloquently, and thanks for the work, of course. And where can people find you online to get more familiar with you and your work if they're not already?
Well, first off, I just want to say thanks to you and for doing this podcast, because I've told like my own origin story of how I got into the business, and I love telling that one. But basically, everything we've talked about for the past 45 minutes, this is like these are the thoughts that I had every day for the past 2 years, and had kind of no one to talk about them with. And as obviously I'm grateful for any marketing and press that I get with this book, but I'm not usually asked about the decisions that I make with dialogue, or what I think that this Facebook's means to the future of VR, and whether basically thanks for asking the questions that as a writer I would want to be asked. And people can find me on blakejharris.com. That's my website. I have some extras up there, and other work that I've done. And then and I think the best place to find me is on Twitter at BlakeJHarrisNYC, because I really make an effort to answer every question that's asked of me, whether it's good or bad. So if you really have something you would like to know, I will almost definitely get back to you on Twitter at BlakeJHarrisNYC.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for the kind words, and let's promise that this is the first of hopefully many times you'll be on the show to talk about your nonfiction writing as we go forward. So thanks again for the time.
Deal. I agree.
That was great, right? I think so. My vote matters, doesn't it? I love it when guests come to play ball, CNFs. Thanks to the show sponsor this week, Goucher College's MFA in Nonfiction, as well as Bay Path University's MFA in Creative Nonfiction. You know what? Be sure to head over to BrendanO'Mara.com for show notes and to sign up for my monthly newsletter. We're talking books, articles, and what you might have missed from the world of the podcast. A lot of cool recommendations, some neat articles. I'm always compiling things for the month, and then I put it in a little digest. It's fun. It's a little growing list. I like it. It's probably one of the highlights of my month, putting it together. Once a month, no spam, can't beat it. I'm at Brendan O'Mara on Twitter and at CNFpod on Twitter. You can email the show, Creative Nonfiction Podcast @gmail.com. Good luck with the typos. You can say something nice. You can ask a question. Maybe I'll even read it on the air. Even consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. Those help, I think. Or they don't. Or you don't have to. It's fine. I love you just the same, man. All right. I got to try to get paid, my friend. Remember, if you can't do, interview. See ya.